At your level, Ethan, adaptability matters. That was the sentence Trevor Hale used right before HR took my laptop. Thursday, 4:42 p.m. I remember the exact time because I looked at the clock behind Melissa Grant's shoulder 3 separate times, trying to understand what was happening. Less than 16 hours earlier, I had been packing fishing gear into the back of my SUV for a lake trip with my wife. The first real vacation we'd planned in 7 years. Then I walked into conference room B. The room was freezing cold. Not normal office cold. That sharp air-conditioned cold companies use in rooms where bad things happen quietly. Melissa from HR sat at the far end of the table with a printed folder already open. Trevor Hale sat beside her wearing that calm executive expression I had seen him use during layoffs before. There was another man near the wall I didn't recognize at first. Security. That was when my stomach dropped. My name is Ethan Walker. I guess I should say that now. 48 years old. Senior Operations Integration Manager at Vayner Logistics Systems. Or at least I was. 17 years with the company. And apparently I was about to lose everything in under 10 minutes. Trevor folded his hands carefully. We're making strategic organizational changes to better align with the future direction of the company. I remember staring at him because 3 years earlier, I had personally trained him on our emergency routing platform after he transferred from corporate development. Back then, he couldn't tell the difference between a warehouse sync delay and a server timeout. Now, he was speaking to me like I was some outdated machine they needed to unplug. Melissa slid a packet toward me without meeting my eyes. Your position is being eliminated effective immediately. Not next week. Not after transition meetings. Immediately. I actually laughed once under my breath because it sounded insane. You're firing me the day before my vacation? Trevor gave this tiny, fake, sympathetic nod executives practice in mirrors. This isn't personal. That line always means the opposite. I asked what happened to the transition plan for Titan Allied Manufacturing. Trevor said Connor Voss would oversee future operations support moving forward. Connor, 31 years old, MBA, sharp suits, expensive haircut, perfect investor language. He talked about logistics systems like they were PowerPoint slides instead of live infrastructure holding together billion-dollar supply chains. Connor had never handled a real operational collapse in his life. But executives loved him because he spoke fast and smiled during presentations. Trevor leaned back slightly. The company needs leadership that aligns with modern scalability goals. Modern scalability goals. I had spent 17 years fixing disasters caused by executives using phrases exactly like that. I looked down at the severance packet, but barely read it. My mind had already gone somewhere else. Mortgage payment next Tuesday. My daughter Olivia's tuition balance. Elaine's medical bills from last year. The cabin reservation I already paid for 6 months ago because my wife kept saying I needed rest before I burned myself into the ground. Meanwhile, Trevor kept talking in that polished tone executives use when they want cruelty to sound professional. Some employees struggle adapting to evolving operational culture. That one hit harder than the firing itself, because I knew what he really meant. Too old, too blunt, too experienced, too difficult to control. Melissa finally spoke. Your system access has already been disabled. Already. Meaning the decision had been finalized before I even entered the room. I slowly reached into my pocket and pulled out my company badge. I set it on the table carefully. Nobody said anything. That silence told me more than the actual meeting did. Trevor avoided direct eye contact after that. Melissa started organizing papers. Security shifted his weight near the door. The whole thing felt rehearsed, like they practiced removing me before I arrived. I packed my office into a cardboard box while younger employees pretended not to notice. One guy from analytics actually turned around and walked the other direction when he saw security beside me. That part stayed with me longer than I expected. Not anger. Embarrassment. 17 years building systems that kept the company alive during crises, and suddenly people acted like I was contagious. Outside, the evening air felt strangely warm after that freezing conference room. I reached my truck and set the box in the passenger seat. Then my phone buzzed. A text message. Richard Velez from Titan Allied Manufacturing. You still good for Tuesday's infrastructure review call? I stared at the screen for a long moment. Then I realized something that made my chest tighten instantly. Nobody had told Titan I was gone, and that was a very dangerous mistake. The drive home took almost an hour, but I barely remember traffic. I just remember staring through the windshield thinking about how fast 17 years could disappear. One meeting, one folder from HR, one younger executive deciding you no longer match the image they wanted investors to see. That was all it took. Vayner Logistics Systems handled shipping infrastructure for major manufacturers across the country. Most people outside the industry never heard of us, which usually meant we were doing our jobs right. Our software tracked warehouse movement, synchronized routing systems, and kept production schedules connected across multiple states. When our systems worked, nobody noticed. When they failed, entire factories stopped moving. I learned that the hard way back in 2012 during the Titan Allied disaster. A warehouse sync failure hit one of Titan's regional hubs outside St. Louis during peak production season. Orders duplicated. Routing signals jammed. Trucks were sent to wrong facilities. Their entire distribution chain started collapsing hour by hour. Executives panicked immediately. Most of the leadership team disappeared into conference rooms to protect themselves while engineers blamed vendors and vendors blamed engineers. I stayed 3 straight days, almost no sleep. I rebuilt damaged workflows manually while sitting on an overturned shipping crate inside a freezing warehouse office. I created backup routing triggers from scratch because the existing recovery systems failed completely. That was where I first met Richard Velez, Titan's COO. Most executives talk differently when things collapse. The polished language disappears. Richard respected people who solved problems instead of protecting presentations. We worked side by side for nearly 20 hours during the worst stretch of that outage. After that week, Titan trusted me directly, not the company, me. That mattered more than leadership ever understood. Over the years, I became the person everyone called when systems broke at 2 in the morning. Holiday weekends, ice storms, cyber attacks, failed updates. I handled the ugly operational problems nobody wanted attached to their names. I never minded the work. What I minded was watching experience slowly become a liability inside corporate culture. Around 5 years ago, everything at Vayner started changing. Executives stopped caring about operational stability and started obsessing over optics. Investor language replaced practical language. Trevor Hale became the perfect face for that shift. Clean suits, calm voice, business school vocabulary. He knew how to sell confidence to people who never touched the systems themselves. Then Connor Voss arrived. Connor was smart in the way consultants are smart. Fast talker, great slides, confident in rooms full of executives. But he treated infrastructure like theory instead of reality. That scared me, because reality always wins eventually. For 2 years, I warned leadership about unstable shortcuts Connor's onboarding teams kept approving to speed up client expansion. They were bypassing recovery safeguards to reduce implementation time. Every time I raised concerns, Trevor framed me as resistant. You always focus on worst-case scenarios, Ethan. Because worst-case scenarios were literally my job. I still remember one executive meeting 6 months earlier. Connor laughed and said, "Ethan still operates like it's 2009. A few managers laughed with him. I didn't, because 3 weeks before that meeting, I had personally stopped a routing failure that would have cost Titan millions. But nobody applauds disasters that never happen. That's the strange thing about operational work. If you do it perfectly, people slowly assume you aren't necessary anymore. By the time I pulled into my driveway Thursday night, the sun was already going down. I sat in the truck for another minute before going inside. Then another thought hit me harder than the firing itself. The emergency recovery systems for Titan, the undocumented balancing triggers, the manual routing overrides during high-volume periods. Most of that knowledge lived almost entirely in my head, and Vayner had just fired the only person still managing it. I woke up Friday morning at 5:26 a.m. out of pure habit. For a few seconds, I forgot what happened. Then I looked over at the chair in our bedroom, where my work clothes were hanging for the airport drive we were supposed to make later that afternoon, and it all came back at once. The HR meeting, the cardboard box, Trevor's voice. I stayed in bed longer than usual, staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly above me. My chest felt heavy in a way I hadn't felt before. Not panic exactly. Something colder than that. Like part of my identity had been removed overnight. Elaine was already awake beside me, reading on her tablet, when she finally looked over. "You're scaring me," she said quietly. I tried telling her I was fine. That lasted maybe 3 seconds. By 6:15, I was sitting at the kitchen table with the severance packet open in front of me, while coffee went cold beside my hand. Elaine stood near the counter watching me, silently, before she finally asked the question I knew was coming. "What happened?" I told her everything. Not quickly, not dramatically, just piece by piece. Trevor, HR, security, Connor taking over my responsibilities. I expected anger from her. Instead, she just looked tired. The kind of tired that comes from watching someone give too much of themselves to the same place for too long. "You gave them 17 years, she said softly. That line hurt more than the firing. Because it was true. I missed birthdays for that company. Canceled holidays. Took calls from warehouses during anniversaries. I spent nights sleeping beside conference room tables during system failures while executives sent great teamwork, emails from hotel bars. And somehow I still believed loyalty mattered. Around mid-morning, my phone started buzzing nonstop. At first, it was small things. A systems analyst asking where emergency configuration files were stored. A project manager asking if I still had access to an old recovery dashboard. Then the messages became stranger. Nobody could find documentation for Titan's backup routing triggers. A warehouse sync issue in Ohio wasn't balancing correctly. Connor's team couldn't access manual override permissions for high-volume freight queues. I sat there reading everything slowly while something ugly started forming in the middle of my chest. They really had no transition plan. They fired me Thursday afternoon without understanding what I actually handled. Or worse, maybe they never understood it at all. Around noon, one of the senior engineers called me directly. "Ethan, where did you keep the contingency script for Titan?" I stayed quiet for a second. "They're not in the central archive?" Long silence. "No, of course they weren't. Leadership refused budget approval for proper redundancy, staffing 3 separate times over the years. Every time I requested documentation support, Trevor pushed it aside for future operational restructuring. Translation, not profitable enough to matter. For most of the afternoon, I walked around the house, trying to ignore my phone. Part of me wanted to help. Honestly, that instinct was hard to kill after so many years. Because operational people are trained to stop disasters before they spread. That becomes your reflex. But every time I started reaching for the phone, I remembered Trevor's expression during the HR meeting. Cold, polished, detached. And Connor standing near the hallway, afterward pretending not to look directly at me, while security escorted me out carrying a cardboard box. That image changed something inside me. I wasn't sabotaging anyone. I wasn't deleting systems. I wasn't taking revenge. I was simply no longer protecting people who chose to remove the person keeping things stable. That night, Elaine and I still drove to the lake cabin. The rain started about halfway there. Dark roads, wipers moving steadily. My phone lighting up every few minutes inside the center console. I ignored all of it. Around 11:18 p.m., after we settled into the cabin, another alert appeared on my screen. This one came from an old monitoring channel tied to Titan's infrastructure systems. Synchronization imbalance detected. My stomach tightened immediately. I knew exactly what that meant. Connor's onboarding modifications had finally started interfering with Titan's backup routing triggers during volume scaling. If nobody corrected it before Monday morning, the failure would spread through multiple warehouse chains at once. I stared at the alert for a long moment while rain hit the cabin windows. Then I locked my phone, placed it face down on the table, and said nothing. I woke up Monday morning to 34 missed calls. Most came in between 4 o'clock and 6 a.m. That was the first sign things had gone bad. Real operational failures don't wait for business hours. They hit in the dark when exhausted managers start realizing nobody understands what's happening anymore. The lake outside the cabin looked calm that morning. Gray water, thin fog hanging low over the shoreline. Elaine was still asleep inside, while I sat on the porch holding a mug of coffee that had already gone cold. My phone kept vibrating against the wooden table beside me. Project managers, engineers, operations leads, even people from departments that normally never contacted me directly. I ignored every single call for almost an hour. Then I listened to one voicemail. "Ethan, please call me back." It was Eric Molina, one of the overnight infrastructure managers. He sounded exhausted. "We're getting cascading sync failures inside Titan's Midwest distribution network. Connor's team can't stabilize the routing queues. Warehouses are manually holding outbound freight because the balancing system isn't responding correctly." I closed my eyes immediately. I knew exactly what happened. 3 weeks earlier, Connor's onboarding group pushed accelerated scaling updates into Titan's infrastructure environment. They bypassed several balancing safeguards I originally designed years ago after the St. Louis collapse. Those safeguards weren't automatic. That was the problem. During heavy shipping periods, the backup routing system needed manual balancing adjustments based on live freight volume. I usually monitored those changes personally because every warehouse network behaved differently under pressure. I explained all of this in reports. Repeatedly, Trevor ignored every warning because Connor promised faster client expansion numbers before the next investor review cycle. Now reality had arrived. At 8:12 a.m., Trevor Hale finally called me himself. I stared at the screen for a few seconds before answering. "Ethan." His voice sounded smoother than panic, but thinner than confidence. "Trevor, how's the vacation?" That almost made me laugh. "You didn't call to discuss the lake." Small pause. "We've had some unexpected infrastructure instability with Titan." Infrastructure instability. Corporate language always becomes softer when executives are scared. Trevor kept talking carefully. "We're trying to stabilize the environment internally, but some legacy recovery configurations are proving difficult to access." Legacy recovery configurations, meaning the systems I built. "The people managing those systems should know where everything is," I said. Another pause. Then Trevor lowered his voice slightly. "Ethan, we may need your assistance on a temporary basis." There it was. Not even 4 days after HR walked me out with security. I leaned back in the chair slowly. "My access was removed Thursday afternoon. We can restore it." Of course they could. Funny how quickly impossible things become possible during emergencies. Trevor tried sounding friendly after that. Casual. Professional. Like we were partners solving a temporary inconvenience together, instead of a company begging help from the man it discarded before vacation. Then he made the mistake that changed everything for me. "Cooperation here would probably look good legally," he said. Legally. Not personally. Not respectfully. Legally. Meaning they already understood how dangerous the situation might become. I stared out across the lake while he waited for an answer. Finally, I said, "I'm out of town with my family." Trevor's tone hardened immediately. "This situation is serious. So was firing your operations manager before a major infrastructure cycle." Silence. For the first time since Thursday, I could hear fear underneath his polished executive voice. Not fear for me. Fear for himself. We ended the call less than a minute later. By late afternoon, the situation had spread far beyond internal panic. At 4:37 p.m., I received a direct message from Richard Velez. "Ethan, why was I not informed you were terminated?" No greeting. No small talk. Just that sentence. I stared at the message knowing exactly how serious this had become. Richard didn't contact people personally unless things were already burning. I called him back a few minutes later. "Richard, you're really gone?" His voice sounded angry in a controlled way. "Dangerous?" "Yes." "Who's managing Titan operations?" I almost answered honestly. "Nobody." Instead I said, "You should probably ask Trevor Hale." Long silence. Then Richard spoke quietly. "This explains a lot. I didn't attack the company. I didn't rant. I simply confirmed the facts." But Richard was smart enough to understand what those facts meant. Before we ended the call, he said one final thing. Our legal team is meeting with your former company tonight. Former company. The words sounded strange in my head, but something told me this story was only beginning. Tuesday morning didn't arrive quietly. It arrived like a system failure nobody could contain anymore. I woke up at 6:03 a.m. and immediately knew something had escalated. Not because of a single call or message, but because my phone was lighting up nonstop again, this time with industry alerts, internal leaks, and names I hadn't seen in years. Former co-workers, senior engineers, even a message from someone inside legal. All of them pointed to the same thing. Titan Allied Manufacturing had filed formal legal action against Vayner Logistics Systems. I sat on the edge of the bed for a full minute without moving. Then I opened the first news summary. Major logistics provider faces legal action after multi-state distribution failure. My stomach tightened. This wasn't internal anymore. This had gone public. By 8:15 a.m., the situation had fully detonated across the company. Even from the outside, I could feel it. When large enterprise clients collapse, it doesn't stay hidden. Supply chains talk, industry partners talk, and competitors talk even faster. Titan was one of Vayner's flagship accounts. The kind executives used in investor presentations. The kind Trevor used to showcase modern, scalable infrastructure partnerships. Now, that same account was the center of a legal crisis. I didn't celebrate. That's not what it felt like. It felt like watching a controlled system finally reveal every hidden flaw it had been covering up for years. Around mid-morning, I got a message from a former senior engineer, Mark Delaney. We're getting destroyed internally. Everyone is asking where the contingency architecture went. No one knows how Connor's team approved those changes without rollback support. Then another message. Trevor is saying the system failures were unexpected environmental dependencies. I actually exhaled through my nose when I read that. Environmental dependencies. A polite way of saying, we removed safeguards and hoped nothing would break. By 10:40 a.m., the internal leaks started spreading. Screenshots of executive emails, meeting notes, decision threads. My warnings were everywhere. Repeated requests to slow down onboarding automation changes. Repeated concerns about bypassed recovery triggers. Repeated rejections from Trevor's side with phrases like, not aligned with strategic velocity targets. They weren't even trying to hide it anymore. The documentation was too clean, too consistent, too damning. At 11:22 a.m., another message arrived. This one from a different engineer. Ethan, we all knew Connor wasn't ready. No one said it out loud, but everyone knew. That one stayed on my screen longer than the others. Because it wasn't new information. It was confirmation of something I had suspected for years. Fear inside organizations doesn't look like chaos. It looks like silence. By early afternoon, the pressure inside Vayner had escalated further than I expected. One of the operations managers I used to work with called me quietly. They're pulling us into emergency war rooms every 2 hours. Trevor is barely holding meetings together. Connor hasn't spoken in the last 2 calls. I ask why. A long pause. Because clients are asking technical questions no one can answer. That was the real breaking point. Not the lawsuit. Not the system failure. The questions. Because once clients realize the people running their infrastructure don't understand the infrastructure, trust collapses instantly. Around 3:05 p.m., Elaine walked into the room where I was sitting. You've been staring at that screen all day, she said gently. I didn't answer immediately. I just showed her the messages. She read quietly for a moment. Then she looked up at me. You didn't do this. I nodded slowly, but I didn't say anything else. Because part of me still felt connected to it. 17 years is not something you detach from overnight. Even when you're pushed out. Even when you're replaced. Even when they pretend you were never essential. That night, Richard Velez called again. This time his voice didn't sound angry. It sounded focused, controlled, like someone standing in the middle of a collapsing system trying to decide what still matters. Ethan, he said, we've suspended all expansion contracts with your former company pending investigation. I stayed quiet. Then he added something unexpected. I want you to consider something after this settles. I already knew where this was going, but I let him say it anyway. We'd like you to consult independently for Titan. For a second, I didn't respond. Not because I didn't understand, but because I did, completely. And for the first time in a long time, I realized something simple. I wasn't invisible anymore. I was just no longer inside the system that took me for granted. And that changed everything. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was anxious in the way I used to be during system outages, but because I couldn't stop reading. Old emails, archived threads, meeting summaries. The deeper I went, the clearer everything became. Not just the failure, but the pattern behind it. Trevor's emails were the first thing I found. Clean, confident, carefully worded. But underneath the professionalism was something sharper. Dismissal disguised as strategy. In one thread, he wrote, Ethan perspective reflects legacy operational thinking that may not align with our modernization roadmap. Legacy operational thinking. That phrase had been used more times than I remembered. In another message to senior leadership, Trevor said, reducing dependency on long-tenured operational staff will improve client perception of agility. Client perception, not client safety, not system stability. Perception. Then I found Connor's contributions. Shorter, faster, more aggressive. He pushed for accelerated deployment cycles and reduction of manual intervention dependencies, which was just another way of saying removing human safeguards I had built after real-world failures. But the most painful part wasn't what they said about me. It was what they said about each other when they thought no one important was watching. One executive wrote, if Walker pushes back again, we need to consider structural replacement. Structural replacement, as if I were a component instead of a person. But then something unexpected appeared in the threads. Hidden support, quiet resistance, messages from mid-level managers who agreed with my concerns but refused to challenge Trevor publicly. One wrote, Ethan is right, but I can't bring this into a leadership review. It won't go well for me. Another, we're skipping too many safeguards. This will break under pressure. That was the part that stayed with me the most. Not betrayal, fear. Because fear is what keeps bad systems alive longer than they should survive. Around 9:10 a.m., I received a formal message from Vayner's legal department, requesting an informal discussion. That wording alone told me everything had changed. When HR fired me, it was cold, procedural, almost rehearsed. Now the tone was careful, respectful, cautious, like they were speaking to someone they suddenly realized they underestimated. I didn't accept. Not without representation. That was the first time I had ever done that. Not because I was trying to escalate anything, but because I finally understood something important. Loyalty without boundaries isn't loyalty. It's exposure. By afternoon, the crisis inside Vayner had deepened again. More clients were asking questions. More systems were failing under load. And Connor, according to one message, was freezing during technical calls where executives expected answers he didn't have. That detail didn't surprise me. You can prepare for presentations. You cannot prepare for systems that fail in real time. Those require experience. Hours of it. Years of it. Sometimes decades. Around 4:50 p.m., another message arrived. This one from Titan's office directly, requesting a private executive meeting later that week. No explanation, just a time and location. For the first time since Thursday, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not satisfaction, something quieter, recognition, because somewhere in all of this chaos, the system had finally stopped pretending, and reality was beginning to speak for itself. Thursday morning felt different the moment I stepped out of the car. Not because the air was different, because I was. Titan Allied Manufacturing's headquarters sat like a block of glass and steel against the gray sky. But today it didn't feel intimidating. It felt observant, like the building itself was waiting to see what would finally be said out loud. I wore the same suit I had on the day HR fired me. I didn't plan that. I just noticed it halfway through getting dressed. Inside the lobby, there was no confusion when I gave my name. No hesitation. No corporate delay where assistants pretend not to recognize you. They were already expecting me. That alone told me how far things had moved. A woman from executive operations led me upstairs without small talk. The elevator ride was quiet, except for the faint hum of machinery moving behind the walls. When the doors opened, I stepped into a room that felt heavier than any HR conference room I had ever been in. Not colder, heavier. Richard Velez stood first. He didn't smile. He just nodded once. Ethan, that was it. No corporate greeting. No forced warmth. Just recognition. Around the table sat Titan's legal team and two senior executives I had only met once years ago during the original warehouse crisis. They remembered me. That mattered more than anything else. Richard gestured toward the seat across from him. Let's go through what happened. No delay. No build-up. Just truth. They walked me through the timeline. System instability. Shipping delays across multiple regions. Manual warehouse holds triggered when routing synchronization failed. Then the internal investigation findings. Email trails. Ignored warnings. Missed escalation points. By the time he finished, the pattern was painfully clear. This wasn't a surprise failure. It was a preventable collapse. I kept my voice calm as I explained the technical side. How the backup routing triggers were designed. Why they required manual balancing under load. What happens when those safeguards are bypassed for speed? No exaggeration. No emotion. Just systems. Because systems don't care about politics. They only respond to structure. One of the legal advisors finally spoke. So this could have been avoided. I nodded. Yes. A long silence followed. Then Richard leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose. That's what we thought. That's when he told me something I wasn't expecting. Trevor Hale had been placed on administrative leave, pending board review. Connor Voss had been removed from all operational decision-making meetings. Not fired yet, but functionally erased from influence. It wasn't revenge. It was containment. Because once a system reveals it doesn't understand itself, leadership stops trusting anyone associated with that failure. After the meeting, I stepped outside alone for a few minutes. The city looked normal. That was the strange part. Traffic moved. People walked. Buildings stood unchanged. But inside corporate systems, everything was shifting at once. My phone started ringing again before I even reached my car. This time it wasn't panic. It was recognition. Recruiters, competitors, former colleagues, even one executive from another logistics firm I had consulted with briefly years ago. One of them didn't waste time with greetings. You're the most important operational mind in enterprise logistics right now, he said bluntly. I almost stopped walking, because that sentence didn't match how I'd felt 7 days earlier. 7 days ago, I was a cardboard box being walked out of an office. Now, I was apparently a system-critical asset everyone suddenly understood they had lost. But the strangest part wasn't that realization. It was what came with it. Clarity. I didn't need to fight anyone. I didn't need to prove anything. The system had already done that for me. By removing me, they had revealed the gap I filled. That evening, I sat alone in my car for a long time before starting the engine. I thought about Trevor's voice during the HR meeting. Not aligned with future direction. I thought about Connor laughing in meetings where real systems were treated like outdated history. And I thought about how quickly everything had shifted once those systems stopped being quietly protected. Not because I sabotaged anything, but because I stopped standing between their decisions and their consequences. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel invisible. I felt correctly placed. Not inside the system, outside it, where truth becomes visible. 2 months passed before everything fully settled. Corporate investigations rarely move fast, but they move steadily when pressure comes from multiple directions at once. Titan reduced its partnership with Vayner significantly. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly enough that everyone in the industry understood what it meant. Trust had shifted, and once that happens in enterprise logistics, it doesn't come back easily. Trevor Hale resigned before the board could finalize its review. Official statement, personal decision, unspoken reality, loss of internal confidence. Connor Voss disappeared from executive visibility entirely. Not publicly fired, not publicly defended either. Just removed from decision paths like a failed experiment no one wanted attached to their roadmap. Vayner survived, but it wasn't the same company anymore, and I never went back. Instead, I started working directly with Titan as an independent consultant. At first, it was structured, limited scope, carefully defined systems work. But over time, other companies reached out. Manufacturers, distribution networks, even competitors who had once ignored me during my years inside Vayner. Now, they listened differently, not because I had changed, but because the outcome had. One evening, months later, I drove past my old office building. It looked smaller than I remembered. Parking lot half full, glass reflecting the fading light. I saw the spot near the side entrance where I used to park every morning for years. The same place security had watched me leave with a cardboard box. I didn't feel anger. Not anymore. Just distance. Understanding. Because I finally saw it clearly. They didn't remove me because I failed. They removed me because I made them uncomfortable. Because I represented something they no longer wanted to prioritize. Stability over appearance. Experience over presentation. Reality over optics. And once I stopped holding their systems together quietly in the background, the truth became impossible to ignore. I kept driving toward my next meeting, not as someone trying to get back what was lost, but as someone who finally understood what it cost to be ignored until everything breaks. And this time, I was exactly where I needed to be.